Ethan Rothschild sat in his penthouse office, the city skyline stretching endlessly before him. The towering glass windows reflected the sprawling metropolis. He ruled over a concrete jungle built on the back of his relentless ambition. His company, Rothschild Innovations, was a global empire developing cutting-edge technologies that shaped industries. To the world, Ethan was untouchable, a genius who turned every venture into gold. Yet beneath his polished exterior lay a man isolated by his own success. The office was cold not from the air conditioning, but from the lack of life. Minimalist furniture, steel and leather accents, and a pristine desk devoid of personal photos. All screamed efficiency, but lacked soul. Ethan liked it that way. He told himself attachments were distractions, that sentimentality had no place in his world. Yet there were nights, quiet, suffocating nights, when the stillness clawed at him. The sterile perfection of his surroundings mirrored his inner world, immaculate but empty. Ethan's life had taken an unexpected turn years ago when he received the devastating news that he was infertile. The diagnosis wasn't just a medical condition. It was a blow to his pride, his identity, and his legacy. The Rothschild name had carried weight for generations, and Ethan had always assumed he would pass it on. But now the weight of his family's expectations rested solely on his shoulders, with no heirs to share the burden. He buried that pain under layers of work, pouring himself into building a legacy in steel circuits and data. As the clock struck 7 p.m., Ethan's assistant entered with a reminder about his upcoming board meeting. He waved her off with a curt nod, his mind already consumed by the agenda. The board had been restless lately, whispering about his leadership. A faction within the company led by ambitious executives was eyeing his position, accusing him of being too detached, too ruthless. Ethan knew they saw his lack of a family as a vulnerability, a sign that he lacked the human touch necessary to lead in a world increasingly demanding corporate empathy. The meeting was tense, as expected. Ethan's sharp gaze scanned the room, landing on each board member like a predator assessing prey. They presented their concerns under the guise of corporate strategy, but Ethan saw through them. He fought back with facts, figures, and the undeniable proof of his success. Yet even as he won the debate, a hollow victory settled in his chest. It was exhausting, this constant battle to stay on top, to prove his worth in a world that valued connections he could never provide. After the meeting, Ethan retreated to his private elevator, descending to the underground garage where his sleek custom-made car waited. The storm brewing outside mirrored his mood, dark clouds casting shadows across the city. He drove aimlessly, the hum of the engine a rare comfort. His mind wandered to the what-ifs he never allowed himself to dwell on. What if he had a family waiting for him at home? A child to laugh with, to teach, to love? The thought felt foreign, almost dangerous, as if entertaining it would crack the fortress he had built around his heart. The rain began to pour, blurring the windshield and obscuring the road ahead. Ethan barely noticed, lost in his thoughts, until the screech of tires jolted him back to reality. A sharp turn, a miscalculation, and his car spun out of control. The world tilted as the vehicle careened off the road, crashing into the ravine below. Metal crumpled, glass shattered, and then a deafening silence. Ethan struggled to move, pain radiating through his body. His vision blurred as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. The rain continued to fall, a relentless drumbeat on the wreckage. For the first time in years, he felt vulnerable, helpless. The man who controlled everything now had no control at all. He tried to call for help, but his voice was weak, swallowed by the storm. As the cold seeped into his bones, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A figure approached, hesitant but determined. Ethan's mind raced, wondering if this was his end, if the person coming toward him was a predator seeking to finish the job. But as the figure drew closer, he saw a woman, thin and ragged, her clothes soaked from the rain. She moved with a purpose, her eyes scanning the wreckage before landing on him. "Hold on," she said, her voice firm but kind. Ethan wanted to scoff. Hold on? He was a billionaire, a titan of industry, reduced to clinging to life in a ditch. Yet there was something in her tone, an authority born not of power, but of experience, that quieted his protests. The woman crouched beside him, her hands surprisingly steady despite the rain and the cold. She checked his injuries, muttering reassurances he barely understood. Ethan, accustomed to commanding armies of employees, found himself surrendering to her care. For the first time in his life, he had no choice but to trust a stranger. As she worked to free him from the wreckage, Ethan caught glimpses of her face. Young but weathered, her eyes carrying a depth that hinted at a life far removed from his world. She didn't ask his name, didn't seem to care who he was. She simply acted driven by an instinct he couldn't fathom. When she finally pulled him free, the pain nearly consumed him, but her grip was firm, grounding him. "We need to move," she said, half carrying him through the rain. Ethan wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. For the first time in years, he felt small and insignificant. The world he had built, the power he wielded, all meant nothing in this moment. The rain continued to fall, the storm unyielding, as the woman guided him to a small makeshift shelter she had constructed nearby. Ethan's body ached, his mind raced, but amidst the chaos, a single thought emerged. Who was this woman? And why, in his moment of greatest weakness, did she feel like the only person who could save him? Clara watched the storm raging above her frayed scarf, doing little to protect her from the relentless rain. She pulled it tighter around her shoulders as she trudged through the muddy paths lining the outskirts of the city. For Clara, storms were a familiar backdrop to her life. Chaotic, unyielding, and indifferent to her struggles. Yet she braved them with the same resilience that had carried her through countless hardships. She wasn't always this way. Once she'd lived a life of comfort with dreams of becoming a teacher and helping others. But that life felt like a distant memory, now swallowed by betrayal and loss. A series of tragedies, an abusive partner, losing her parents, and mounting debts, had left her homeless. Now she spent her days scavenging for food, trying to survive one day at a time. The kindness she once freely gave was now a luxury few extended to her. As she rounded a bend in the road, Clara stopped abruptly. Something metallic glinted through the rain. A mangled car wedged precariously in a ravine. Her instincts urged her to turn away. Trouble often followed scenes like this, and she had enough problems of her own. But a faint sound reached her ears, barely audible over the storm. A groan? A cry for help? Clara hesitated, torn between self-preservation and the nagging pull of her conscience. She sighed and made her way down the slope, her boots sinking into the muddy earth. The sight was worse up close. The car was a twisted wreck, its glossy surface scarred by the crash. As she peered through the shattered window, she spotted a man inside, slumped against the seat, his face pale and streaked with blood. He was conscious, but barely. His eyes fluttered open as she leaned closer. "Help!" he rasped, his voice weak. Clara's heart tightened. He was alive, but he wouldn't stay that way for long if she didn't act fast. She tried the car door, but it was jammed. Gritting her teeth, she grabbed a jagged piece of metal and pried it open, wincing as it sliced her hand. She ignored the pain, focusing on the man before her. "You're lucky I came by," she muttered, her tone brisk. "Can you move?" He shook his head, slightly wincing as pain shot through him. His tailored suit was torn, and his hands, though bloodied, looked out of place amidst the wreckage. He was someone important. She could tell by the air of authority clinging to him, even in his weakened state. But Clara didn't care who he was. In this moment, he was just a man who needed help. She assessed his injuries with quick efficiency. His left leg was likely broken, and there was a gash on his forehead that needed tending. Clara rummaged through her satchel, pulling out a piece of cloth she used as a bandage. She pressed it against his wound to stem the bleeding. "This is going to hurt," she warned, before tying the makeshift bandage around his head. He winced but didn't protest. His silence surprised her. Most people, especially men of his stature, would be barking orders or questioning her every move. But he just watched her with a mix of confusion and exhaustion. "Who are you?" he managed to ask, his voice barely audible. "Doesn't matter," she replied curtly. "What matters is getting you out of here before the rain makes things worse." Clara struggled to pull him out of the car, the weight of his body nearly overwhelming her. She wasn't strong, but desperation gave her strength. With one final tug, she managed to free him, dragging him a few feet away from the wreckage. The rain soaked them both to the bone, but she couldn't stop now. "Can you stand it all?" she asked, crouching beside him. He shook his head again, his jaw clenched in pain. Clara sighed, brushing a wet strand of hair from her face. "Fine. You're just going to have to trust me. She positioned herself under his arm, gritting her teeth as she bore his weight. Step by agonizing step, they made their way up the slope. Clara's legs burned with effort, and her injured hand throbbed, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The man's breathing was labored, his head lolling against her shoulder. He was clearly fighting to stay conscious. Clara spoke to him, her voice firm but calm. Stay with me, okay? I'm not dragging you all this way for you to give up now. His lips twitched, almost forming a weak smile. Bossy, aren't you? Someone has to be, she shot back, her tone laced with dry humor. By the time they reached the top of the ravine, Clara was nearly out of breath. She scanned the area, spotting her makeshift shelter in the distance. It wasn't much, just an abandoned storage shed she'd turned into a temporary refuge. But it would have to do. The journey to the shelter felt endless, every step a battle against exhaustion. When they finally reached it, Clara all but collapsed inside, gently lowering the man onto a pile of blankets she had scavenged. She lit a small lantern, its warm glow casting shadows on the walls. The man shivered, his soaked clothes clinging to him like a second skin. Don't move, she instructed, rummaging through her belongings for anything useful. She found a tattered first aid kit and returned to his side, carefully removing his jacket to assess his injuries. His leg was swollen and discolored, a clear sign of a break. Clara frowned. She wasn't a doctor, but she'd learned a thing or two about survival over the years. This is going to hurt, she said again, meeting his gaze. A lot. He nodded, bracing himself. Clara worked quickly, splinting his leg with 2 pieces of wood and some cloth. His sharp intake of breath told her it was painful, but he didn't cry out. She admired his stoicism, though she wouldn't say it aloud. When she was finished, she sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her brow. That's the best I can do for now. You'll need a real doctor soon. Why? Are you helping me? He asked, his voice hoarse. Clara shrugged, avoiding his gaze. I couldn't just leave you there. He studied her for a moment, as if trying to decipher her. Most people would. I'm not most people, she replied simply. Silence settled between them, broken only by the sound of the rain pounding against the roof. Clara busied herself with tending to her own injured hand, wrapping it in a piece of clean fabric. She felt his eyes on her, but she didn't look up. Thank you, he said softly, the words carrying more weight than she expected. Clara nodded, brushing off his gratitude. Get some rest. You'll need your strength. She moved to the corner of the shelter, giving him space. As she leaned against the wall, exhaustion washing over her, she couldn't help but wonder who this man was. His clothes, his demeanor. They spoke of a life she couldn't imagine. But here in this moment, none of that mattered. For now, he was just another soul weathering the storm, and she was the one keeping him afloat. And for reasons she couldn't quite explain, that felt like enough. The storm had subsided by morning, leaving behind a damp gray sky and a world dripping with the remnants of last night's chaos. Clara stirred, first her eyes scanning the small shelter. The man, Ethan, she'd finally learned his name during the brief exchanges of the night, was still asleep on the makeshift bed of blankets, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rhythmic breaths. For the first time in years, Clara felt something beyond her usual survival instincts. There was a strange pang of concern in her chest, a lingering need to see him safe, before she disappeared back into her usual solitude. The decision to leave him was already made. It always was when Clara crossed paths with strangers. Staying too long in someone else's life only invited trouble. People meant questions, judgments, and ties she couldn't afford. This man, this wealthy, polished, clearly out-of-place man, was no exception. She didn't belong in his world, and he certainly didn't belong in hers. Ethan stirred, slightly groaning as he shifted his leg. Clara walked over her footsteps, soft on the damp floor. His eyes opened, hazy at first, but quickly sharpening as they met hers. Morning, she said, crouching beside him. How are you feeling? Like I got hit by a truck, he muttered, his voice still hoarse. But alive, thanks to you. She smirked, faintly brushing her damp hair out of her face. Well, you're not out of the woods yet. Literally. Ethan looked around, his gaze lingering on the small, worn-down interior of the shelter. His expression shifted as though he was trying to reconcile the stark contrast between this place and the penthouse office he was so used to. I need to get back, he said, his tone firm despite his condition. I have people. "You have enemies too," Clara interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. "Those men looking for you last night weren't here to rescue you. If you go back without a plan, you'll end up worse off than you were in that car." Ethan blinked, surprised by her directness. For a moment, he saw a flash of something in her, a wisdom born of experience of living on the edge where survival wasn't guaranteed. He wasn't used to people challenging him, much less someone like her. Yet oddly, he respected it. "And what's your plan?" he asked, leaning back against the wall. "I don't have one for you," she replied simply. "But I can get you to the nearest road. After that, you're on your own." Ethan frowned, his lips pressing into a tight line. It wasn't often he found himself reliant on others, and even less so on someone so utterly removed from his world. But he also knew she was right. Whoever had sent those men to finish him off wouldn't stop until their mission was complete. With Clara's help, Ethan managed to stand, leaning heavily on her shoulder, as they made their way out of the shelter and back onto the muddy trail. Every step was a test of endurance, each one reminding him of how much he owed this strange, unrelenting woman. They didn't talk much during the trek. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. When they reached the road, Clara paused, looking back at him one last time. Ethan steadied himself against a tree, his breathing labored but even. "You're sure you don't want me to call someone for you?" he asked, searching her face. Clara shook her head. "I'll be fine. People like me always are." The words stung Ethan in a way he didn't expect. She said it so matter-of-factly, as though her life of struggle was simply an unchangeable fact. He wanted to say something, offer her help, a way out, but the look in her eyes stopped him. Clara didn't want pity, and she didn't want charity. "Thank you," he said instead, his voice soft but sincere. "For everything." She nodded, offering him a faint smile. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. Ethan watched her go, a strange ache settling in his chest. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. Back at his penthouse, Ethan felt like an alien in his own home. The sterile luxury that once brought him pride now felt hollow. The pristine surfaces, the towering windows, the carefully curated art. All of it seemed meaningless after what he had experienced. His assistant Miranda fussed over him as soon as he arrived, arranging for doctors to tend to his injuries and ensuring his rivals believed he'd simply been away on a business retreat. But none of it mattered. Ethan's mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the past 2 days. Clara's face lingered in his thoughts, the determination in her eyes, the strength in her voice. She had risked everything to save him, yet she had walked away without expecting anything in return. In his world where every action was transactional, that kind of selflessness was unheard of. Ethan found himself pacing his office late into the night, staring out at the city lights. He thought about the way she had dismissed his offer of help, the way she had carried herself despite her circumstances. Who was she? What had brought her to that ravine of all places? And why did he feel such a desperate need to find her again? The next morning, Ethan made a decision. He called his head of security, tasking him with finding Clara. He didn't have much to go on, just her first name and a vague description, but he was determined. This wasn't just about gratitude anymore. It was about something deeper, something Ethan couldn't articulate, but felt with an intensity that startled him. Weeks passed with no leads. Ethan threw himself into his work, trying to distract himself, but every meeting, every conversation felt like a shadow of what it used to be. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life, his carefully constructed empire, was missing something fundamental. One evening, as he sat in his office reviewing reports, an idea struck him. Clara might not want help, but there were others like her who did. He began quietly funding initiatives to aid the homeless, creating shelters and outreach programs under the radar. It wasn't a solution, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Clara continued her life as she always had, moving from place to place, avoiding attention. But something about Ethan lingered in her thoughts. She had seen plenty of people in desperate situations, but there was something different about him. His gratitude had been genuine, his offer of help unselfish. For the first time in years, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the life she had resigned herself to. Clara's resolve wavered as the weeks turned into months. She thought of the twins growing inside her, a miracle she had never thought possible. She wasn't ready to face Ethan, not yet, but she knew that someday she would have to. For their sake, if not her own. Ethan, too, couldn't let go. He continued his search, pouring more resources into finding the woman who had saved him. Every day, without a lead, felt like a failure, but he refused to give up. Somehow he knew their paths would cross again, and when they did, everything would change. The morning began like any other for Ethan Rothschild. His sprawling penthouse, bathed in sunlight, the distant hum of the city below, a constant reminder of the empire he commanded. But for Ethan, the success that once defined his life had grown hollow. Despite his attempts to distract himself with work and philanthropy, his thoughts often drifted to Clara. Months had passed since their fateful encounter, but her image lingered. Her unwavering resolve, her piercing eyes, and the mystery she carried with her. He had all but given up hope of finding her when a knock on his door shattered his morning routine. His assistant Miranda entered, her face unusually tense. "There's someone here to see you," she said hesitantly. She refused to give her name, but said it's urgent. "Should I call security?" Ethan frowned. He rarely had unexpected visitors, and the cryptic nature of the message unsettled him. Yet something about Miranda's tone, the faint unease in her expression, sparked his curiosity. "Send her in," he said, standing from his desk. The door opened, and Clara stepped inside, clutching a bundle in her arms. She looked different. Her frame thinner, her clothes even more worn, but her presence was unmistakable. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. For a moment he thought he was imagining her, a figment of his restless mind finally made real. "Clara," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "You're here." She didn't respond immediately. Her gaze flicked around the opulent room, taking in the stark contrast to her world. Then she stepped forward, her movements hesitant, and adjusted the bundle in her arms. It was only then that Ethan noticed it wasn't just one bundle. It was two. "These are yours," she said, her voice steady, but laced with an undercurrent of emotion. "Our children." Ethan's world tilted. The words hung in the air, heavy and surreal. He stared at Clara, then at the two tiny faces peeking out from the blankets she held. A boy and a girl, their soft features impossibly small, yet achingly familiar. His mind struggled to process what she was saying. "Children?" He echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara nodded, stepping closer and carefully placing the babies on the couch. They stirred slightly, their tiny fists curling. Ethan took an involuntary step back, his heart pounding in his chest. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. "It doesn't make sense," he said, shaking his head. "I can't. I was told I couldn't have children." "I was told the same thing," Clara replied, her tone calm but firm. "But here they are. A miracle, I suppose." The weight of her words hit him like a tidal wave. For years, Ethan had lived under the shadow of his infertility, a constant reminder of the legacy he could never leave behind. Yet here stood Clara, the woman who had saved him, holding not one, but two children she claimed were his. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, his voice laced with equal parts confusion and frustration. Clara sighed, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I didn't know how. I didn't even think it was possible at first. By the time I realized, I was already too far along. And you have your world, your life. I didn't think you'd want this." Ethan's heart clenched at the vulnerability in her voice. "Clara, you saved my life. Do you really think I wouldn't want to be part of theirs?" Her eyes flicked up to meet his, searching for sincerity in his words. "Your world isn't kind to people like me, Ethan. It would have swallowed me whole." Ethan crossed the room in two strides, his usual composure shattered. "I don't care about that. None of it matters. What matters is them. And you." Clara blinked, her resolve faltering for the first time. For months she had braced herself for this moment, expecting rejection or indifference. But Ethan's reaction was far from what she had imagined. He didn't look angry or resentful. He looked overwhelmed, yes, but also determined. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because this isn't something you can walk away from." Ethan knelt beside the couch, his gaze fixed on the tiny faces of the twins. He reached out hesitantly, his hand trembling as he brushed his fingers against the soft cheek of the baby girl. She stirred slightly, letting out a small sigh, and Ethan felt something inside him break open. It was as though a part of him he had buried long ago was suddenly alive again. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Clara watched him, her heart a confusing mix of relief and fear. She had spent so long running from her past, from connections that could hurt her, that letting someone in felt almost impossible. But seeing Ethan like this, vulnerable human, it gave her a sliver of hope. The hours that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Ethan demanded answers not out of anger, but out of a desperate need to understand. Clara explained how she had discovered her pregnancy, the disbelief she had felt, and her struggle to survive while carrying the twins. She spoke of the fear that kept her away, the nights spent wondering if she had made the right choice. Ethan listened intently, his mind reeling at the enormity of it all. Every detail only deepened his admiration for her strength. Yet questions lingered, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. "I don't understand," he said at last. "How is this even possible? I was told it was impossible for me to father children." Clara shrugged, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Sometimes life doesn't follow the rules. Ethan couldn't help but smile back, though his thoughts remained tangled. He would get answers, scientific ones if he had to. But for now, he let the wonder of the moment wash over him. By evening, the twins were resting in a temporary nursery Ethan's staff had set up. Clara stood by the window, staring out at the city lights. She felt out of place in this world of wealth and power, yet something about Ethan's presence grounded her. "You don't have to stay," she said quietly as Ethan approached. "If this is too much, I can handle it on my own." Ethan shook his head, his expression resolute. "I'm not going anywhere, Clara. I missed the first part of their lives. I'm not missing another second." His words carried a weight that Clara couldn't ignore. For the first time in years, she felt the faint stirrings of trust. Maybe, just maybe, this man, flawed but sincere, could be the partner she never thought she'd find. The night ended with Ethan sitting in the nursery watching over his children as they slept. His mind raced with plans and possibilities, but his heart was calm for the first time in years. The twins weren't just a miracle. They were a second chance, a reminder that life's greatest gifts often came when least expected. And as he sat there, the man who once believed himself sterile and alone felt the faint flicker of something he thought he had lost forever: hope. Ethan Rothschild's penthouse had always been a testament to efficiency and control, a place where everything had its order, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. But in the days following Clara's return with the twins, the once sterile space transformed into something unrecognizable. Toys were scattered across plush carpets, a diaper bag sat propped against an ornate armchair, and the faint scent of baby powder now lingered where the crisp aroma of polished wood and expensive cologne had once dominated. For Ethan, it was a disorienting adjustment. His mornings, previously filled with high-stakes conference calls and meticulous routines, now began with the cries of his infant son or the soft gurgles of his daughter. He found himself pacing the nursery in his tailored pajamas, trying to soothe a wailing baby while reading articles on parenting from his phone. His assistant Miranda, who had long been the unflappable orchestrator of his professional life, looked equally out of her depth as she navigated diaper deliveries alongside scheduling board meetings. Clara, too, was navigating uncharted territory, but her struggles were of a different kind. She wasn't used to the opulence that surrounded her. The marble floors, the glittering chandeliers, the view of the city that stretched endlessly in every direction. It all felt foreign, overwhelming. The staff, though polite, looked at her with veiled curiosity, as if trying to piece together how a woman like her had found herself in the world of billionaires. Clara avoided their eyes, keeping to the nursery or the guest room Ethan had insisted she take. For Ethan, balancing his new responsibilities with his old life was a challenge he hadn't anticipated. He'd always been in control, able to command rooms full of executives and make decisions that impacted thousands of lives. But fatherhood was a different kind of challenge. No amount of strategic planning or negotiation tactics could prepare him for the unpredictability of two newborns. One afternoon, Ethan sat in the nursery, his son cradled in one arm while he attempted to review a quarterly report on his tablet with the other. His daughter lay in a bassinet nearby, occasionally letting out soft coos. Clara entered the room, quietly pausing at the door to watch him. He looked out of place, his expensive shirt wrinkled and his tie discarded somewhere on the floor, but there was a softness in his expression that she hadn't seen before. "You know you can ask for help," Clara said, stepping inside. Ethan glanced up, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "I'm not used to needing help." "Well, you're not exactly doing it alone," she replied, gesturing to the baby in his arms. "But you're trying." He chuckled softly, shifting his son into a more comfortable position. "I've negotiated billion-dollar deals, but somehow this feels harder." Clara leaned against the crib watching him. "Because this actually matters." Her words hung in the air, unspoken truths woven between them. Ethan looked up at her, his gaze lingering for a moment before he spoke. "I want to make this work, Clara. Not just for them, for us. I know this isn't the life you're used to, but..." She cut him off with a wave of her hand. "It's not about the life, Ethan. It's about trust. And right now I'm still figuring out if I can trust this world of yours." Ethan nodded, understanding her hesitation. He knew his world wasn't kind to outsiders, especially not someone like Clara, whose past was so far removed from the glitz and power of his reality. But he was determined to show her that she belonged here, not as an obligation, but as a partner. The challenges they faced weren't just personal. Ethan's enemies, always circling like vultures, now saw his newfound family as a weakness to exploit. Tabloids caught wind of Clara's presence, spinning stories about the mysterious woman and her connection to the billionaire. Photos of Ethan pushing a stroller or holding one of the twins outside his penthouse made headlines, drawing scrutiny he hadn't anticipated. At first, Clara tried to ignore it, focusing on the twins and their daily routines. But the whispers from the staff and the invasive questions from reporters lurking outside the building began to wear on her. One afternoon, while scrolling through her phone, she came across an article dissecting her background, or rather attempting to. Speculative headlines painted her as everything from a con artist to a gold digger, and her chest tightened with a familiar pang of shame and frustration. Ethan found her in the nursery, her expression stormy as she stared out the window. When he asked what was wrong, she showed him the article, her voice tight, as she said, "This is what they think of me. This is what your world does to people like me." Ethan's jaw clenched as he read the article. "They don't know you, Clara, and they don't matter. They might not matter to you, but they make me feel like I don't belong here," she said, her voice breaking slightly. Ethan set the article aside, stepping closer. "You belong here because you belong with them," he said, gesturing to the sleeping twins. "And with me. Let them talk. They don't define who you are." Clara looked at him, her walls momentarily crumbling under the weight of his sincerity. She wanted to believe him, but years of hardship had made trust a difficult thing for her. Still, the way he looked at her like she was more than just the mother of his children made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, she could find a place here. As the days turned into weeks, small moments of connection began to bridge the gap between their worlds. Ethan learned to juggle midnight feedings with corporate responsibilities, often taking calls with a baby in his arms. Clara found herself slowly adjusting to the rhythm of life in the penthouse, though she still kept a part of herself guarded. They worked as a team, sometimes stumbling, but always finding their way back to each other. One evening after the twins had been put to bed, Clara joined Ethan on the balcony, overlooking the city. The air was cool, the lights below twinkling like stars. For a while they stood in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. "You know," Clara began, her voice quiet, "I spent so long running from anything that felt permanent. It just seemed easier that way." Ethan turned to her, his expression soft. "And now?" She hesitated, then met his gaze. "Now I'm starting to think that maybe I don't have to run anymore." Ethan reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. "You don't. Not with us." The words hung between them, a promise and a hope. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could build a life here. A life where she wasn't defined by her past, but by the love she was beginning to let herself feel. As they stood there, the twins sleeping soundly inside the vast city stretched before them, they both realized that this new life, messy, challenging, and imperfect, was worth every step of the journey. Together they would face whatever came next, not as two individuals from different worlds, but as a family finding their way forward. Ethan had always been a man who thrived on control. For years, his sharp instincts and relentless drive kept his empire thriving, making him untouchable in the corporate world. But since Clara and the twins entered his life, he felt the fragility of his position more keenly than ever. They were his world now, and their vulnerability weighed on him. While Clara adjusted to her new surroundings and the twins brought chaos and joy to his once sterile penthouse, Ethan's enemies were watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. The first sign of trouble came subtly, almost innocuously: a missed delivery of baby formula. It wasn't uncommon for minor errors to occur, but Miranda, Ethan's fiercely efficient assistant, assured him it had been sent as planned. Then there was the sudden influx of media attention. Paparazzi, who once ignored his private life in favor of covering his corporate exploits, now seemed to camp outside his building. Headlines ranged from speculative to outright slanderous, dissecting Clara's past and questioning her motives for being in his life. Ethan worked tirelessly to protect her calling in his legal team, to silence defamatory stories, and hiring additional security to shield his family from prying eyes. But no matter how many fires he put out, more seemed to spring up. He knew this wasn't a coincidence. Someone was orchestrating these attacks. His rivals, those who had always resented his unshakable grip on Rothschild innovations, were exploiting his newfound family to weaken him. Clara sensed the tension before Ethan even told her. The warmth she was beginning to feel in her new life was tinged with unease, as though something sinister lurked just beyond the edges of her happiness. She caught Ethan on the phone late at night, his voice low and sharp as he issued orders to his security team. When she confronted him, he tried to reassure her, but she saw through his calm facade. "It's nothing I can't handle," he said, pouring himself a glass of scotch in the dim light of the living room. "Just corporate politics. It happens." Clara crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "Corporate politics doesn't explain why I can't leave the building without someone following me, or why the twins' names are suddenly on every tabloid." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had underestimated her intuition. "You're right," he admitted. "It's more than that. Some of my competitors think they can use you and the twins to get to me. They're trying to make me look weak, distracted." Clara's stomach tightened. "And what happens if they succeed?" "They won't," Ethan said firmly. "I won't let them." Despite his confidence, Ethan knew the situation was precarious. His enemies weren't just targeting his reputation. They were probing for weaknesses, testing how far they could push before he broke. And then, as if to confirm his fears, the real threat arrived. One afternoon, Clara decided to take the twins for a walk in the private garden attached to the building. It was a rare moment of peace, the air crisp and the twins happily babbling in their stroller. But as she rounded a corner, a man stepped into her path. He was tall, with a lean, wolfish grin that made her instincts flare. Clara immediately tensed, gripping the stroller tighter. "Clara," the man said smoothly, as though they were old friends. "Long time no see." Her blood ran cold. She knew that voice. It belonged to Marcus, a figure from her past she had spent years trying to escape. He was the reason she had fled her old life, the reason she had been living on the streets when she met Ethan. And now he was here, standing between her and safety. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. Marcus tilted his head, his grin widening. "Isn't it obvious? You've landed yourself in quite the situation, haven't you? A billionaire, two adorable kids, and a cozy little life. I'm impressed." Clara's mind raced. How had he found her? And worse, what did he want? She knew Marcus wasn't here out of curiosity. He had always been a leech, feeding off others' vulnerabilities. "I don't have anything for you," she said coldly, taking a step back. "Leave me alone." "Oh, I think you do," Marcus replied, his tone dripping with menace. "Your boyfriend has deep pockets. It'd be a shame if something happened to tarnish his shiny reputation." Before Clara could respond, one of Ethan's security guards appeared, stepping between her and Marcus. The guard's presence was enough to make Marcus back off, but the look he gave Clara as he walked away sent chills down her spine. This wasn't over. When Clara told Ethan what had happened, his reaction was immediate and furious. He doubled the security detail around the penthouse, forbidding her from leaving the building without an escort. But Clara could see the strain it placed on him. He was already dealing with threats from his rivals, and now her past had become another weapon for them to use against him. "I should have told you about Marcus," she said one night as they sat in the living room, the twins asleep in the nursery. "I didn't think he'd ever find me." Ethan shook his head, his expression softening. "You don't have to apologize. He's the problem, not you." Clara leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. But he's not going to stop. He'll keep pushing, and your enemies will use him to hurt you. Ethan reached out, taking her hands in his. Then we fight back. Together. The days that followed were a whirlwind of plans and countermeasures. Ethan's legal team worked tirelessly to track Marcus's movements and expose his connections to Ethan's rivals. Meanwhile, Ethan and Clara grew closer, their shared determination forging a bond that neither had expected. Clara, who had always fought her battles alone, found comfort in Ethan's unwavering support. And Ethan, who had built his life on independence, realized the strength in leaning on someone else. But the final blow came when Marcus, in a desperate attempt to get what he wanted, leaked his story to the press. The tabloids exploded with fabricated claims about Clara's past, painting her as a manipulative opportunist who had trapped Ethan for his wealth. The headlines were vicious, and the backlash was immediate. Ethan called an emergency press conference. Standing in front of the cameras with Clara by his side, he addressed the rumors heated. He spoke of her bravery, her resilience, and the love they shared. For the first time, he let the world see him not as an untouchable billionaire, but as a man fiercely protective of his family. The strategy worked. Public opinion shifted, and the scrutiny that had once been a weapon against them became a shield. Ethan's rivals, realizing they had overplayed their hand, retreated. Marcus, too, disappeared back into the shadows, his leverage gone. As the storm passed, Clara and Ethan found themselves stronger than ever. They had faced danger and betrayal together, emerging not unscathed but unbroken. Their love, once hesitant and fragile, was now a fortress built on trust and shared purpose. And as they sat together in the nursery that night, watching their twins sleep, they knew they had weathered the worst. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a family, united, resilient, and ready for whatever came next. The weeks following the confrontation with Marcus and Ethan's corporate rivals marked a turning point in both their lives. The chaos, the fear, and the endless battles had given way to a tentative calm. For the first time in what felt like years, Ethan could breathe without the weight of an impending threat pressing down on him. But the journey wasn't over. Redemption, he realized, wasn't about winning battles. It was about rebuilding, reconnecting, and finding meaning in a life that had once been defined solely by ambition. Ethan began with small but significant changes. He restructured his company's leadership, carefully removing those who had plotted against him, while empowering employees who had proven their loyalty and integrity. It was a difficult process, one that required him to confront the very culture of cutthroat competition he had once fostered. He attended meetings with a new perspective, not just as a CEO, but as a man who had something far more important to protect: his family. Clara watched these changes with quiet amazement. She had always assumed that men like Ethan, powerful, wealthy, and untouchable, were incapable of genuine transformation. But the man before her was different from the cold, calculating figure she had first met in that ravine. There was a softness to him now, a willingness to listen, and a determination to do right by the people in his life. One evening after the twins had been put to bed, Ethan joined Clara on the balcony. The city stretched out before them, its lights glittering like stars. He leaned against the railing, his gaze distant but thoughtful. "Do you ever think about how strange this all is?" he asked, breaking the silence. Clara turned to him, her expression curious. "What do you mean?" He gestured toward the nursery inside, where the faint sound of the twins' soft breathing could be heard through the baby monitor. "This, us. A year ago, I was so consumed with my work, with proving myself, that I never imagined having a family. And now, it's the only thing that matters." Clara studied him for a moment, her heart softening. People change, Ethan. Sometimes it takes something big to shake them out of their old ways. He looked at her, then his gaze steady. "You did that for me. You and the twins. You gave me a reason to care about something more than money or power." Clara smiled, faintly brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You've done the same for me, you know. I didn't think I'd ever trust someone again. But here we are." The honesty between them was raw, unfiltered. In that moment, they weren't the billionaire and the woman from the streets. They were just two people who had found each other against all odds. Ethan's journey toward redemption wasn't limited to his personal life. Inspired by Clara's resilience and the struggle she had endured, he began using his resources to create real change. His first initiative was a foundation aimed at addressing homelessness and providing support for vulnerable populations. He poured money into building shelters, funding job training programs, and offering healthcare services to those who needed them most. Clara became an integral part of these efforts, her firsthand experiences lending authenticity and insight to the foundation's work. She attended meetings with Ethan, offering perspectives that he and his team could never have understood on their own. Though she was initially hesitant to step into such a visible role, Ethan's unwavering support gave her the confidence to embrace it. "You have a voice, Clara," he told her one afternoon as they reviewed proposals for the foundation's first project. "People need to hear your story. You can inspire them in ways I never could." Clara nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's not just my story, though. It's the story of so many people out there. If we can give them a chance, maybe we can make a difference." The work was challenging but fulfilling, and it brought them closer as a couple. Ethan marveled at Clara's ability to connect with people, her empathy cutting through the barriers that had often left him feeling isolated in his world of wealth and power. And Clara, in turn, saw a side of Ethan that few others ever had. A man driven not by greed, but by a genuine desire to leave the world better than he found it. Despite their progress, doubts and fears still lingered. One evening, as they sat together in the nursery, Clara voiced the thoughts that had been weighing on her mind. "Do you ever wonder if this is all too good to be true?" She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That one day, it'll all fall apart?" Ethan glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "Why would it?" Clara hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "Because life is a way of taking things away when you finally start to feel like you have something worth holding on to." Ethan reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "That's not going to happen, Clara. Not if I have anything to say about it." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "You can't control everything, Ethan. No one can." He smiled, faintly brushing a tear from her cheek. "Maybe not, but I can promise you this. I'll fight for us. For you, for the twins. Whatever it takes." His words were a balm to her fears, and for the first time in a long time, Clara allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future free from the shadows of her past. The twins, blissfully unaware of the struggles their parents had faced, thrived in the love and stability that now defined their lives. Ethan cherished every moment with them, from their first smiles to their early attempts at crawling. He found joy in the simplest things, feeding them, reading to them, or just holding them as they drifted off to sleep. One evening, as he rocked his son in his arms, Ethan reflected on how much his life had changed. The man who had once prided himself on his independence and ambition was now happiest in the quiet moments with his family. For the first time, he understood what it meant to truly live, to find purpose in something beyond oneself. Clara watched him from the doorway, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had spent so much of her life running, from her past, from her fears, from the possibility of happiness. But Ethan had shown her that it was okay to stop, to trust, to build something new. And as she stood there watching the man she loved cradle their child, she realized that she was no longer running. She was home. Ethan's redemption arc wasn't just about proving himself to others. It was about proving to himself that he could be more than the sum of his past mistakes. Through his family, his philanthropy, and his love for Clara, he found a sense of purpose that had eluded him for so long. And in the quiet moments when the world outside seemed far away, he knew that he had finally found what he had been searching for all along: a life worth living and people worth living it for. The Rothschild estate, once a symbol of unattainable luxury and cold efficiency, had transformed into a home brimming with life and love. The penthouse, once pristine and sterile, now echoed with the soft laughter of children and the quiet hum of a family finding its rhythm. For Ethan, Clara, and the twins, the journey toward building a new life wasn't without its challenges, but it was a journey they were determined to navigate together. Ethan sat on the floor of the nursery, his back propped against the wall, as his son toddled unsteadily toward him. The boy's steps were wobbly, but determined, his tiny arms outstretched as if reaching for something only he could see. When he finally collapsed into Ethan's arms with a triumphant giggle, Ethan couldn't help but laugh, his heart swelling with pride. Clara watched from the doorway, cradling their daughter, who had just drifted off to sleep. Her smile was softer expression, a mixture of love and awe. She had never imagined this life for herself. A life where happiness wasn't fleeting, where every day wasn't a battle for survival. But here it was unfolding before her eyes, as real and solid as the ground beneath her feet. "I think he's going to be a runner," Ethan said, looking up at Clara with a grin. "He's already faster than I expected." "Or a climber," Clara replied with a chuckle. "He tried scaling the crib this morning." Ethan groaned, theatrically shaking his head. "Remind me to invest in baby-proofing, or maybe a padded room." Clara laughed, her voice light and musical. It was a sound Ethan never tired of hearing, a reminder of how far they had come. For all the storms they had weathered, moments like this made it all worth it. Their life together wasn't without its complexities. Ethan's decision to scale back his role in Rothschild Innovations had sent ripples through the corporate world, sparking speculation and rumors. But Ethan was resolute. His family came first. He delegated much of the day-to-day operations to trusted executives, choosing to focus on projects that aligned with his new vision. His foundation, now fully operational, had become a cornerstone of his legacy, providing housing, education, and support for those in need. Clara played a central role in the foundation, lending her voice to initiatives that addressed the struggles she knew firsthand. At first, she had been hesitant to step into such a public position, worried about the scrutiny it might bring. But Ethan's unwavering belief in her abilities gave her the confidence to embrace the opportunity. Together, they visited shelters, spoke at events, and worked tirelessly to turn their shared vision into a reality. One day, as they walked through a newly built community center funded by the foundation, Clara stopped to watch a group of children playing in the courtyard. Their laughter filled the air, unburdened by the struggles that had once defined her own childhood. "This is what it's all about," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "Giving them a chance to just be kids." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her. "You've made that happen, Clara. You've given them that chance." She turned to him, her eyes shimmering with tears. "We did this together." The twins grew quickly, their personalities blossoming with each passing day. Clara marveled at how different they were despite sharing the same beginnings. Their son was bold and adventurous, always testing boundaries and exploring new corners of their home. Their daughter, on the other hand, was thoughtful and observant, her quiet curiosity a mirror of her mother's introspective nature. Ethan embraced fatherhood with a passion that surprised even himself. He attended every milestone with an enthusiasm that left Clara laughing and shaking her head. From their first steps to their first words, he was there, camera in hand, documenting every moment as if it were the most important event in the world. One evening, after the twins had been tucked into bed, Ethan and Clara found themselves alone in the living room. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. Ethan poured them each a glass of wine, settling beside Clara on the couch. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" he asked, his voice quiet. Clara smiled, leaning against his shoulder. "All the time. It feels like a different lifetime sometimes, who we were before this." Ethan nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I spent so much of my life chasing things that didn't matter. Power, wealth, recognition. But now I look at the twins, at you, and I realize that none of that meant anything compared to this." Clara reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "It's strange, isn't it? How life takes you places you never expected. I thought I'd spend my whole life running, surviving. But here I am sitting beside you, thinking about what kind of future we can give our children." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of their shared journey settling between them like a quiet promise. For all their differences, for all the obstacles they had faced, they had found something rare and precious. A partnership built on love, trust, and resilience. As the months turned into years, Ethan and Clara continued to build a life rooted in their shared values. The foundation flourished, expanding its reach and impact. The twins grew into bright, curious children who filled their days with laughter and questions about the world around them. And through it all, Ethan and Clara remained each other's anchor, their bond only growing stronger with time. One afternoon, as the family gathered in the garden for a picnic, Ethan watched Clara play with the twins. The sunlight danced across her face, illuminating the joy in her eyes as she chased their son around the lawn. Their daughter sat beside Ethan, giggling as she handed him a daisy she had plucked from the grass. "Thank you, sweetheart," Ethan said, tucking the flower behind her ear. "You're as beautiful as your mother." The little girl beamed her smile, a perfect reflection of Clara's. Ethan's heart swelled with gratitude, the weight of his old life a distant memory. He had everything he had ever wanted, though it had taken him far too long to realize it. As Clara returned to the picnic blanket, breathless and laughing, Ethan reached for her hand. She looked at him, her expression curious. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing," he said, smiling. "Just thinking about how lucky I am." Clara raised an eyebrow, a teasing smile tugging at her lips. "Are you getting sentimental on me, Mr. Rothschild?" Maybe, he admitted, pulling her close. "But I think I've earned it." She laughed, leaning into him as the twins climbed onto their laps, chattering excitedly about their latest discoveries. In that moment, surrounded by love and light, Ethan and Clara knew they had found something worth fighting for. A life filled with meaning, a legacy built on hope, and a family that would endure no matter what challenges lay ahead. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, they sat together, their hearts full and their future bright. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was theirs, and that was more than enough.